During the Hungry Ghost Festival, it's not hard to offend the spirits. Stay too long, and they'll make sure you never leave. Lanterns Glow, submitted by Ming. Growing up in Penang, the Hungry Ghost Festival was always a time of caution. My mother used to warn me every year, never stay out too late when the lanterns are lit. The spirits are watching. It was the time when the gates of the underworld were said to open, releasing wandering spirits into our world. Offerings would line the streets, joss paper burned, and lanterns lit to guide the lost souls. One year, I didn't listen. I was 17 at the time, eager to prove that I wasn't afraid of superstitions. My friends and I had been out late, celebrating at a nearby food stall. The streets were filled with people, laughter echoing through the night as we sat beneath the lanterns, their soft glow flickering in the evening breeze. The festival was in full swing. Paper effigies burned in barrels, and people placed offerings of food and incense on makeshift altars. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and roasted meat, but underneath it all, there was an unsettling stillness. Something felt off. As midnight approached, my friends started to head home. They all had the same excuse. Their parents had warned them to be home before the lanterns burned out. I brushed it off, telling them I'd stay a little longer. The streets had emptied by the time I decided to leave. The lanterns were still glowing, casting long shadows on the pavement, but the usual liveliness of the festival had faded. As I walked home, I noticed something strange. The offerings, plates of food, cups of tea, even entire roasted pigs, were still sitting on the altars, untouched. Normally, the stray dogs and cats would have picked them clean by now, but tonight everything was as it had been left, as if the spirits had truly come to feast. A cold breeze swept through the street, and the lanterns flickered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of my home. It wasn't until I turned down a quiet alley that I saw it. At the far end of the alley, beneath a single flickering lantern, stood a figure. It was a man, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His posture was rigid, unnaturally still, and something about him sent a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The alley was too narrow to turn back without being noticed, and the only way forward was past him. I hesitated, but then I heard a soft whisper, carried on the wind. "Don't stop." I didn't know where the voice came from, but it spurred me into motion. I walked forward, my eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the figure as I passed. My heart raced, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but I didn't dare look up. Just as I reached the end of the alley, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see the man, but the alley was empty. The lantern was still flickering, but the figure had vanished. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps as I sprinted the rest of the way home. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, my heart still racing. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, my mother found me sitting at the kitchen table, my eyes bloodshot and my hands shaking. I told her what had happened, about the man in the alley and the whisper that had urged me forward. She didn't say a word at first, just nodded slowly as she set a cup of tea in front of me. "You were lucky," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The spirits are restless during the festival. They watch for those who linger too long." After that night, I never stayed out late during the Hungry Ghost Festival again. Every year, as the lanterns are lit and the offerings are made, I remember the man in the alley and the cold, unnerving weight of his gaze. Some say the spirits wander only to find their way home, but I know now that some of them are watching, waiting for the ones who stray too close to their world. After that sleepless night, things started to change for me. It wasn't just the memory of that strange figure in the alley that haunted me. It was the feeling that something had shifted. I couldn't explain it, but I started noticing things. Small, barely noticeable at first, but unsettling all the same. For one, the lanterns. Every time I walked past a lantern in the days following the festival, it seemed to flicker, even when there was no breeze. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, I had been warned about staying out late during the Hungry Ghost Festival. Maybe it was just my guilty conscience playing tricks on me. But then other things started happening. The house where I lived with my family was old, but it had never creaked or groaned the way it started to after that night. Late at night, I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were faint, like someone walking on tiptoes, but the sound was unmistakable. Every time I opened the door to check, the hallway would be empty. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I strained to hear the words. The voice was coming from just outside my window, but when I looked, there was nothing but the shadow of the lantern swaying in the night. The whispering stopped as soon as I opened the window. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. It felt like the man from the alley hadn't just disappeared, he had followed me. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. In the market, in school, even at home. The feeling of cold eyes on the back of my neck became so familiar that I could almost anticipate when it would happen. One evening, about a week after the festival, I was helping my mother clean the altars we had set up for the spirits. The offerings had been cleared, and the lanterns had all been snuffed out. The festival was officially over, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. "Do you think the spirits really leave when the festival ends?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice casual. She paused, wiping her hands on a cloth before turning to me. "The ones who are at peace, yes, but not all spirits find their way back to the other side. Some linger." "Linger?" I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. She nodded slowly. "Yes, especially if they feel they have unfinished business, or if someone crosses them during their time here." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me. Had I crossed the spirits by staying out late that night? Had I angered the man in the alley? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something wrong, something that had invited a spirit to follow me. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, and every shadow seemed to twist into a shape I didn't recognize. My mind was racing with thoughts of the festival, of the man, and of the strange occurrences that had followed. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would bring me some peace, but as soon as I lay down, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, clearer. "Why didn't you listen?" I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice was right next to me, so close that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. Panic set in. I scrambled out of bed, bolting down the hallway to my parents' room. I banged on the door, my voice trembling as I called out to them. But as soon as I opened my mouth, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. My parents came to the door, bleary-eyed and confused. "What's wrong?" my mother asked, concern etched on her face. I heard something," I stammered, "a voice in my room." She exchanged a worried glance with my father before leading me back to my room. They checked every corner, every window, but there was nothing. No voice, no figure, just the oppressive silence. For the next few nights I slept with the lights on, but even that didn't help. The whispering never returned, but the footsteps did. I would lie awake, listening to the soft tread of footsteps pacing the hallway outside my room, stopping just outside my door. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to see the village elder, an old woman who had lived through more Hungry Ghost festivals than anyone else I knew. Her house was filled with incense, the scent so thick it clung to my clothes the moment I stepped inside. She listened as I told her about the man in the alley, the lanterns, the whispering, and the footsteps. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to see something beyond the physical world. "You should never have stayed out that night," she said finally, her voice low. "The spirits are easily angered when their time is disturbed. You invited one to follow you." My heart sank. What do I do? The elder stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she reached for a small, ornate box on a shelf. She handed me a bundle of incense sticks and a small, worn piece of joss paper. "Go back to the place where you saw the spirit. Light the incense and burn the paper as an offering. Apologize, beg for forgiveness, and hope the spirit lets you go." That evening, I returned to the alley where I had seen the man. The streets were quiet, and the lanterns had long since been taken down, but the memory of that night was still fresh in my mind. The alley looked different in the daylight, smaller, less imposing, but as I stood there, the familiar coldness settled over me again. I lit the incense and placed it at the entrance of the alley, my hands shaking as I held the joss paper in my palm. I whispered the words the elder had told me, asking for forgiveness, begging the spirit to leave me in peace. As the paper burned, the smoke curled into the air, disappearing into the fading light of the evening. For a moment, nothing happened. The alley remained still, the shadows unmoving. But then, I felt it, a shift in the air, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The coldness that had followed me for days was gone, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt since before the festival. I left the alley that night feeling lighter, but I never forgot the man I had seen under the lantern's glow. Even now, years later, every time the Hungry Ghost Festival comes around, I make sure to heed my mother's warnings, because I know now that the spirits are watching.